I was used to being the first to stand up every Christmas. No one ever asked me to, but every year it was the same. I would raise my glass, smile, and try to bring a little warmth to the table. Part of me wanted to share. Part of me, perhaps, just wanted to be seen, to be heard, even for a few seconds. Tonight was no different. The tree still stood in the corner, golden lights flickering against green branches. The kitchen carried the smell of cinnamon and baked apples. Lucas was showing pictures of his daughter playing in the snow. Helena was talking about baking, while Violet's eyes were fixed on her phone. The atmosphere was calm, as if everything had been programmed from last year. I stood up, glass of wine in hand. I was just honored as one of the top 10 most influential UX designers of the year. I said it softly, as if afraid my voice might shatter the peace. But it turned out I didn't disturb anything at all. My mother didn't look up. She only sighed and said, "Don't talk about work, Elise. Christmas is for family." Then she turned to Lucas, her voice suddenly bright. "My son was invited to become head of department at the hospital this year." Applause erupted. Helena gasped in admiration. Violet giggled, and me, I was still standing there, my glass untouched. I had once built an app that helped over 10 million people overcome insomnia. It had been mentioned at a global medical conference, even named by Forbes. But in this house, I was only Elise, the middle child, whose birthday no one remembered. I noticed the pearl necklace around Violet's neck, the gift I had given my mother last year. Did she give it to Violet? Or did Violet take it? I didn't know, and I didn't dare ask. I sat down, unlocked my phone out of habit. An unread email appeared, an investment offer of $2 million. I stared at it for a few seconds, then locked the screen. Christmas was not the time to boast, but sometimes I wondered, in this house, had I ever really been called by my name? My name is Elise Navarro. I'm 34 years old, single, no husband, no children, no pets. I live in Seattle, in a loft apartment overlooking Lake Union, quiet enough to hear the morning streetcar, far enough from downtown that no one really knows who I am. I am the founder and CEO of a design company with 12 employees. Small, but our products are used everywhere. The US, Canada, Germany, Japan. An app that helps insomniacs. A platform that supports people with anxiety disorders. A tool that helps the visually impaired read more easily. I love my work. I can spend hours adjusting the spacing between two lines of text, simply because I believe a thoughtful interface can make someone feel truly heard. I've appeared in a few major magazines, Wired, even Forbes. Sometimes I scroll past my own name in an article and still can't believe it's real. But the strange thing is, no matter how many articles exist out there, the moment I come home, I vanish, as if I never existed. I am Elise, but in my family, I am the middle Elise. Lucas is the eldest. Helena is the second. Violet is the youngest. And me? I stand in the middle, squeezed in between, and then forgotten in between. No one remembers my birthday. One year, my mother texted me the wrong date. Another year, she forgot entirely, only remembering when Violet reminded her. "Oh, is it Elise's birthday this week?" I don't get angry anymore. I've only learned to expect less. At work, people remember. My employees once threw me a surprise party, cupcakes with numbered candles, a handmade card. I keep that card next to my monitor, a quiet reminder that somewhere out there, I am seen. Perhaps like that birthday card, I am remembered, but always last. There are 4 siblings in my family. On paper, no one outranks anyone, but growing up here, I learned quickly that love had a hierarchy. Sometimes, it was even ranked as clearly as a chart taped to the refrigerator. Lucas, the eldest, tall, composed, speaking with the confidence of someone born to be a doctor. My mother often said, "Lucas is the pride of the Navarro family." He is now a resident at a major hospital, and every time he visits, my mother invites the neighbors to dinner just to brag. My son is about to be promoted to head of department. She pours his tea, but never once has she poured mine. Helena, the second sister. She once worked at a small media company, then quit when she had her first child. My mother never called it quitting. She used the word sacrifice. Every time Helena told stories of her child learning to read or draw, my mother would hold her hand and whisper, "You truly are a model mother." As if giving birth was a miracle and raising a child was a medal shining brightly enough to erase everything unfinished in her life. Violet, the youngest, most stubborn, and of course, the most adored. I once caught her skipping school and being summoned to the principal's office, but when my mother found out, she only sighed and blamed herself. "It's my fault. I've pressured her too much." Part of me felt jealous. Part of me was afraid that one day Violet would grow up believing every mistake could be forgiven just because she was the baby. And me? At 17, I received a full scholarship. I carried the letter home, hoping to see my mother smile at me, just once. She glanced at it and said, "Well, good thing that school isn't hard to get into." I learned to swallow everything. Just like swallowing forgotten birthdays, misspelled names in text messages, the glances my mother lingered longer on others. In some families, everyone sits at the same table. In mine, it feels like a row of ranked seats, and I sit right in the middle, close enough not to be abandoned, but never chosen to be called first. Perhaps this feeling of being in the middle wasn't only because of my place among the siblings, but also because of the two people who gave me life. My parents, opposites I was always balancing between. My mother, Vivian, was strong in the way that left no room for weakness, neither from others nor herself. She liked to control everything, from mealtimes to the color of the curtains to decisions that should have been mine. She didn't need to yell. Each look, each carefully timed silence, was its own warning. She didn't like surprises. She didn't like anyone acting without her permission. And of course, she didn't like her children straying from the script she had written. Once, she tore up an acceptance letter. It was the year I was admitted into a prestigious summer program in New York, a rare opportunity reserved only for first-year students nominated by professors. I was about to book a flight, but when she discovered the letter, she held it for a long time, then asked, "You decided this without asking me first?" And then she ripped it in half, slowly, so I could see each tear as the price for stepping out of line. My father, Carlos, was the opposite. He rarely spoke. At noisy dinners, he simply nodded, smiled faintly, and ate in silence. Yet somehow, I always knew he cared. He would leave a bag of my favorite chocolate chip cookies in the kitchen. Sometimes, he would knock on my door late at night, just to hand me a warm glass of milk. When I skipped meals, he never asked why. He would just quietly pour me a glass of orange juice and leave. We didn't say much to each other, but in his eyes, I saw something quietly resisting the invisible order that ranked affection in our home. I never told him I noticed. He never said how he loved me. But in this house, where everything had a sound, perhaps only his love was enough to be understood without words. After the day my mother tore up the New York acceptance letter, I slowly learned how to hide my desires where no one could see them. I no longer left scholarship letters on the dining table. I didn't print posters to pin on my bedroom wall. Even the times teachers praised me, I folded the compliments into memories and tucked them quietly into my backpack. Private gifts for myself alone. I began skipping the after-school tutoring sessions, those soft skills workshops my mother forced me to attend because she heard they would make me more confident in public speaking. But I didn't want to learn how to speak well. I wanted to learn how to create something that could make people feel lighter, calmer, the way I always wished I felt when walking back home. The school library sat in an old building, low ceiling, yellow lights dimming as if they might flicker out. But to me, it was the brightest place in the world. I spent hours there, learning how to use Figma, then Sketch, then fumbling through HTML and CSS. I downloaded free apps, analyzing every interface, every user behavior. I wrote everything down in a black notebook, slanted handwriting, neat, without erasures. Each page became a world I could build, a world I could control. No one asked what I was doing. No one cared where I was. Once, my homeroom teacher called home to report I had skipped class. My mother didn't say a word to me. She simply increased my math tutoring sessions and signed me up for a national exam prep course. I still went to the library. Some days it rained, wind seeping through the cracks in the window, freezing my hands. But inside, my heart glowed a little each time a curved border appeared on the first interface I designed. It wasn't beautiful, but it was mine. And in a world where no one saw me, creating something I could see for myself, at that time, for me, was already a miracle. I once thought that if I tried hard enough, my mother would eventually see me as someone worth being proud of. That year, I was 15, chosen to compete in a national app design contest for high school students. The theme was Technology Solutions for Mental Health. I didn't know much about psychology, but I knew what it felt like not to be heard. So I turned it into a simple interface where users could record daily feelings and receive a kind message in return. I stayed up many nights finishing the project. No one told me to go to bed. No one asked what I was doing. When I made it to the finals, I printed the announcement and placed it neatly on the table. My mother glanced at it and said, "That day I'll be at Mai's wedding, my best friend from college." I nodded. On the day of the award ceremony, I took the bus alone to the convention center. When the announcer read my name, my hands shook so hard I nearly dropped the certificate. The stage lights shone straight into my eyes, so bright I couldn't see the rows of seats below. Yet I still searched, just to confirm what I already knew. She wasn't there, and no one else was either. After the event, I stopped by a small bakery, bought a cupcake and a #1 candle, not to celebrate winning, but to preserve the feeling that today mattered. I ate the cupcake in my bedroom, alone, and what saddened me wasn't that my mother chose someone else's wedding. It was that I wasn't surprised. After that award ceremony, I began to understand. Not everyone shows up in the moments that matter to you. And sometimes, you can show up in someone else's life in the quietest way. I often thought of Helena, my second sister. She who once shone like a stage light, now dimmed like a bulb losing power. After her second child, she no longer seemed herself. She laughed less, ate less. One evening at dinner, she suddenly burst into tears because the soup was too salty. My mother brushed it off. Women are always sensitive after giving birth, then quickly changed the subject to Lucas. I didn't see it as sensitivity. I saw someone sinking, and no one cared to look. I researched, called around, booked her appointments with a therapist specializing in postpartum depression. I signed up for a 3-month program, put my name on the payments. I told no one. I didn't do it because I thought I was noble. I just couldn't bear to watch someone who had once been the light in our house learn how to survive alone in the dark. She went regularly for 12 weeks. Gradually, her laughter returned, first forced, then real. Months later, my mother bragged to the neighbors, "My daughter is so strong. She overcame it all by herself." I smiled. I didn't correct her, because some things you do aren't meant to be known. They're just so the ones you love don't collapse when no one else sees them. In the end, perhaps it was easier for me to help others than to learn how to be seen by them. Those nights spent researching Helena's symptoms, finding doctors, reading about postpartum disorders, they made me realize something. Too many people were wrestling with silent pain, like her, and like me. I began to nurture the idea of creating a safe space for those who couldn't sleep, who lived with anxiety, who panicked in the night with no one to talk to. Not a clinic, but an app where users could track emotions, learn how to breathe, how to cut through spirals of negative thoughts. I named it Mind Ease because I knew sometimes all a person needs is one thing to soothe the mind so they can walk themselves out of the abyss. I quit my old job, gathered my modest savings, and added a little recklessness to start. 3 years later, Mind Ease reached 8 million users. I was invited to speak at a global mental health conference. A few investment funds approached for the next round, but my mother only asked, "That app helps people sleep? Why don't you do something more respectable?" I didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer expected her to understand. Back at the office, I looked at my team. 12 people pouring their energy into something the world once thought was small. And I saw clearly. Some values are only recognized outside the family home. And some loves, like mine for Mindies, don't need anyone's approval to be real. Mindies kept growing. I still worked 12, 14 hours a day, not because of some blind passion for startups, but because for once in my life, I finally had something I could truly control. But then, just as the company began to turn a profit and I allowed myself a small sigh of relief, my family started knocking, never directly, always in the form of casual stories that I couldn't help but step into. Lucas called late one night, his voice hesitant. He said his tuition had increased because he'd switched specialties and his insurance hadn't cleared yet. I overheard his wife saying something on the other end. Then he coughed lightly and asked, "Could you lend me something? Just a small part. Just enough to get through this term." I wired the money the next morning. I didn't reply to his message. A few weeks later, Helena called. Her car broke down while taking her kids to school. She told it like gossip, but I heard the strain behind her forced laughter. I contacted a friend at a dealership, paid 30% upfront for a safe little car in her name. When the papers arrived, she texted me in surprise. "Was this you?" I only replied, "Just make sure you can drive the kids safely." Then it was my father's turn. His back pain returned, leaving him unable to climb the stairs. My mother dismissed it, saying it was normal with age. But I quietly asked a doctor I knew, sent him the scans, and was advised to enroll my father in intensive physical therapy. I booked a 3-month package, paid in full, told them not to mention my name. I didn't do any of this to buy love. I didn't even feel I should. It was simply because I had grown used to being the anchor. So used to it that even when no one asked, I still wondered, if not me, then who else? I did it all in silence. Because in my family, silence was always the first language, and I was the only one who had learned how to use it to love. I used to think that if I kept quietly giving, at least, I could preserve peace in the family. But then came Violet. My youngest sister, the baby of the house, had just graduated and landed a marketing job at a small firm. When she got it, my mother's joy was obvious. We even celebrated as if it were the dawn of a new chapter. But within 6 months, one night, Violet called me, her voice trembling, stripped of its usual playfulness. "Hey sis, I ran into a little problem. Just a small misunderstanding, really." The little problem turned out to be falsified reports she had sent to a client, signing the director's name to close the contract. When discovered, the company issued an internal warning, but the client threatened to sue. She was terrified of court, of losing her job, of our mother finding out. I didn't scold her. I didn't even ask why. I just said, "I'll take care of it." I hired a skilled lawyer specializing in commercial disputes. I signed for everything: apology letters, settlement agreements. Within a month, the case was closed. Violet kept her job. The family never found out. One evening, I overheard my mother at dinner. "Thank goodness Violet is so clever. She handled it all. Anyone else would have been ruined." I stayed quiet, not because I was hurt, but because I was used to it. In my family, what I did was often credited to someone else, while I remained the shadow behind the curtain, adjusting the lights, arranging the stage, then slipping away before anyone noticed I was ever there. I didn't expect thanks. But I began to wonder, had anyone ever seen my presence as anything but a given? When people grow too used to you standing behind, they assume you never need to stand beside anyone. Perhaps my mother thought that too. I met Thomas when I was 28, a software engineer at an AI startup. Quiet, gentle, always remembering I liked chamomile tea without sugar. Each time we met, he brought a small bag of snacks, something no one in my family had ever remembered for me. We weren't loud. We didn't make grand promises, but there was something in the way he listened that made me feel seen. Not for what I could do, but simply for who I was. It took me a long time to dare bring him home. Just a regular Sunday dinner. Lucas and Helena were there. My mother made roast and salad, her eyes already scrutinizing as if by habit. Throughout the meal, she asked Thomas about his job, his salary, his plans to settle. He answered honestly, without pretense. As I stood up to pour water, my mother turned to Helena and said casually, "Elise should find someone more worthy of her." No one reacted. No one defended me. Thomas smiled politely, but under the table, I saw his hand tighten into a fist. That night, he said nothing. We still took our walk, still parted with a gentle hug, but a few weeks later, he requested a transfer to Austin. And I didn't stop him. I didn't blame him. I only blamed myself for letting one careless sentence shake someone who once believed I was enough to be loved. After that, I never brought anyone home again. Not because I feared judgment, but because I dreaded seeing someone's gaze dim on my account, simply because I didn't measure up to someone else's definition of worthy. Once is pain, but many times become a warped belief that maybe I truly wasn't worth loving. I kept working. I kept quietly covering things in the family. Lucas's tuition, Helena's car, Violet's reckless mistakes. They still accepted, still thanked me, sometimes with words, more often with silence. And I taught myself to call that enough. But over time, I felt something inside me begin to grind. Like a worn gear still turning, but starting to squeal. I began asking myself, if I disappeared, how many of these things I'd done would anyone actually notice? I didn't need applause. I didn't need my mother to deliver a grand speech, apologizing for years of hurt. I just wanted to be seen as a human being with limits, not an emotional bank, not a shadow convenient to lean on. I thought about speaking up, about sitting down and saying clearly, I can't keep doing this, but I stayed quiet. Because silence had been my way of life for so long. It was familiar, to the point where breaking it felt like betraying myself. And I wondered, did I have the courage to set boundaries, even with the people I loved? I used to think that if I stayed silent long enough, everything would feel easier. But that Christmas, I realized, some pains cannot be compressed forever without eventually breaking. The atmosphere was the same as every year. The tree in the corner, strings of lights blinking, cinnamon and vanilla candles. The red tablecloth, my mother bustling in the kitchen. Helena arrived with her 2 children, Lucas with his wife, Violet in a glittering dress, and me, as always, the earliest to arrive, setting the silverware, reheating the bread. Dinner began with clinking glasses and compliments for Lucas. My mother told everyone he had just been invited to lead a new clinical research team. Helena teased, "Brother Lucas is about to be famous." Laughter filled the room. Then came praise for Helena. Such a devoted mother, as my mother boasted that her youngest could now read the alphabet. Violet announced she had just been accepted as a communications assistant at a fashion company, still only on trial, but the family cheered as though she had won a prize. I sat, listening, nodding, smiling. Then I took a sip of wine, summoned all my courage, and said, I was just named one of the top 10 most influential UX designers of the year. Mindease now has over 10 million users. No one spoke. Only my mother looked up, as if trying to recall what I had just said. Then she put her glass down and delivered a sentence that pierced straight through the softest part of me. Elise, you are the one I'm least proud of. I heard every word, clear, unmistakable. No one reacted. Lucas glanced at his phone. Helena pretended to slice the cake. Violet looked at our mother, then turned to the window. Christmas was supposed to be about togetherness, yet in that crowded room, I had never felt so utterly alone. I sat there, staring at the cold salad in front of me, wondering, was this the last time I would try to sit at a table where there was no place for me? When my mother said those words, I heard something break. Not the glass on the table, but inside my chest. A fracture that silence could no longer mend. I set my wine glass down. The sound against the wood was dry, unlike the cheerful clinks moments earlier. My hand didn't shake, My voice didn't tremble. Only my heart pounded, as if it knew I was about to shatter a script that had been rehearsed for 30 years. All this time, I've been the one paying for most of the things in this house. The room froze for a beat, then erupted in murmurs. Helena frowned. "Elise, what are you talking about?" Lucas shook his head. "Don't exaggerate. We all take care of ourselves." Violet smirked. "You're joking, right?" I didn't argue. I simply took out my phone, opened my banking app, and scrolled through the transfers. Tuition for Lucas, down payment for Helena's car, physical therapy fees for my father, even the lawyer's bill that Violet never knew about. I turned the screen around, placed it in the middle of the table. Nothing more. The room grew heavy. The Christmas music from the small speaker still played, but it sounded distant, as if from another world. Helena lowered her gaze. Lucas pressed his lips. Violet turned away. My mother stared at the screen, her face expressionless, as though none of those numbers belonged to her. I drew in a deep breath. In that moment, I realized I had just done the one thing I had avoided for years, pulling silence into the light, refusing to let it swallow me whole. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I only wanted to declare that I existed, that what I had done would no longer remain invisible, taken for granted. And for the first time, I let the truth speak for me. I don't remember exactly how things ended after that. Only the blank faces, the Christmas table turned into an empty stage where I no longer had a reason to sit. I put on my coat, grabbed my bag, walked out. No one stopped me. No one called my name. The cold wind struck my face, but it wasn't as sharp as the silence behind me. Thomas had been waiting in the yard. He had planned to pick me up after dinner, but when he saw me emerge earlier than expected, his eyes flickered with surprise, then softened. He didn't ask. He just opened the car door. We drove away from the familiar street, Christmas lights blurring through the window. I sat in the passenger seat, hands resting still on my lap. Inside the car, only the steady hum of the engine and the rhythm of our breathing, a quiet music that felt safe. I said nothing. Neither did he. But this silence was different. Not denial, not the heavy shadow of family. It was a space wide enough for me to breathe, to exist without needing to prove anything. The car stopped at a small hotel on the outskirts, the place where we had our first date. Old brick walls, faded beige curtains. I walked in, collapsed onto the simple bed, and only when my head hit the pillow did the tears finally come. I cried as though years of accumulation had found their escape. Not with choking sobs, just a silent stream, heavy with both relief and exhaustion. Thomas didn't ask. He only sat beside me, letting me lean into his shoulder. And that night, for the first time in years, I allowed myself to be weak. The next morning, I woke in the old hotel room, my eyes still swollen from a night drowned in tears. Thomas brought coffee, set it on the table, asked nothing more. I thanked him, voice hoarse, then gazed through the fogged window. A strange feeling came over me, as though I had stepped out of the spinning wheel and for the first time was standing outside, watching. Meanwhile, at home, the family gathered without me. Helena later told me. My mother began, as always, with, "Elise is just overreacting. She'll be fine." Lucas bent over his phone, saying nothing. Violet shrugged. "She's probably stressed." No one objected. No one defended me. Only my father, sitting silently at the head of the table. He spoke no words the entire time, offered no opinion. People might have thought he agreed, but I knew that silence was the only way he could still hold me close when every spoken word could be dismissed by my mother. Hearing Helena recount this, I wasn't as hurt as I expected. Instead, I felt a rare clarity. I had stepped away from that round table, and their world kept turning as if I had never been there. Perhaps absence sometimes says more than any argument, and for the first time, I felt that my absence was a way of existing. After I left the Christmas table, everything in the family seemed to continue spinning as before. But I knew my absence had begun to carve out spaces they hadn't anticipated. The first to feel it was Lucas, my eldest brother, the brightest pride of my mother, a resident doctor at a major hospital. Everyone saw him as successful, but no one knew that behind the white coat were mounting student loans and bills piling up each month. In the past, whenever he faced difficulties, all it took was a short message to me. "Can you help me?" And by the next morning, everything was taken care of, smoothed over as if no problem had ever existed. But this time was different. Helena later told me about a dinner at Lucas's apartment. His wife sighed, staring at the stack of papers, and asked, "I thought Elise would help, like she always does?" Lucas was silent for a long time, then for the first time admitted, "She's cut it off." Just 4 words, but I could picture his face when he said it. The helplessness mixed with disbelief, as though I had betrayed some unspoken contract. Hearing that, I realized a bitter truth. When kindness is given too easily, it ceases to be seen as a gift and becomes an obligation in the eyes of the receiver. And when that obligation is withdrawn, people don't remember what was once given. They only resent what is no longer there. I had inadvertently turned myself into a familiar lifebuoy, so that when I pulled back, they resented me as if I were the one who had pushed them into the waves. I didn't blame Lucas. I knew he was good, devoted to his profession. He had simply grown accustomed to my silent presence as something guaranteed. But my protection had made him forget something important, that he could manage on his own, if only he wasn't so dependent. I didn't rejoice in his struggles, but neither did I regret stepping back. Because sometimes love isn't about always rescuing. It's about stopping in time so the other person learns how to stand. And in that moment, I knew I had done the right thing. Not to make Lucas suffer, but to free both him and me from the cycle where my silence only nurtured ingratitude. After Lucas, the next to feel my absence was Helena. My second sister was still praised by my mother as the model mother, the one who sacrificed her career to devote everything to her children. But what my mother never mentioned were the mornings when Helena soothed a crying child while rushing to prepare food, trying to get both kids to school with the car broken, the babysitter gone, and her husband busy with his own affairs. Before, whenever she called, all it took was a little rearranging on my part. Either I picked up the kids, or sent money for a babysitter, or quietly mailed her a gas card to ease her worries. Everything flowed smoothly, as if those difficulties never existed. But when I withdrew, everything stood bare. Helena began being late to school drop-offs, forgetting parent meetings. She snapped over small things, even yelled at the children, then burst into tears right after. In a rare phone call, her voice cracked. "You know, I didn't realize how much I relied on you." Hearing that, my throat tightened, because all these years, I had never received a thank you like that. The kindness I had given had long been assumed as duty, and only in my absence did she recognize how large the gap really was. I loved Helena, but I also understood. My protection had deprived her of the chance to build her own resilience. When someone grows accustomed to a shoulder always there to lean on, they never learn balance. And when that shoulder pulls away, they collapse. And sometimes even resent you for no longer carrying their weight. I didn't want Helena to become such a person. Not because I was cold, but because I believed she was stronger than she thought. All she needed was space. Space enough to stumble. Space enough to learn how to rise on her own feet. And perhaps real love isn't about keeping someone safe forever, but about allowing them to sway, and then watching them grow steadier after the fall. If Lucas and Helena merely fumbled without me, Violet stumbled even further. My youngest sister, still our mother's baby, once again landed in trouble. This time, worse, falsifying documents for a project, caught, and facing possible litigation. When the official letter arrived, Violet panicked, clutching her head, crying over and over, "I didn't mean to. I thought it would be fine like every other time." I listened with both pity and bitterness, because those other times she spoke of, all had been times when I cleaned up her mess. My easy protection had taught her that her mistakes would always fall into a safety net, and when that net disappeared, she panicked, as though the entire world had betrayed her. The day our mother found out, the shock was so great, she collapsed right there in the living room. The family rushed her to the hospital, doctors diagnosing a mild stroke, thankfully treated in time. I wasn't there. I only heard through a hurried call, Helena's voice trembling. "Mom collapsed. The doctor says she needs long-term monitoring." Silently, I paid the entire hospital bill, signed the admission guarantee under my name, but left no trace. On the papers, all they saw was paid in full. Even lying in her hospital bed, my mother still whispered reproaches. "Why have you children worried me like this?" No one mentioned me. No one said that for years, it was I who carried the unseen burdens she never even noticed. When Helena recounted it to me, I sat for a long time in my apartment, staring at my empty hands. I had once believed kindness was a kind of light, that giving it would naturally spread, but now I saw. When that light is too easy to touch, people see it as a lamp that must switch on whenever they need. And when it goes dark, they don't recall how many times it once lit their path. They only curse the darkness. I pitied my mother. But I also knew I had helped shape her into someone who always assumed Elise would handle it. And the resentment now was the price of years I gave unconditionally, in silence. I asked myself again and again, was my sacrifice love, or just a way of enabling ingratitude? After my mother was hospitalized, I still kept the habit of quietly paying bills, never letting my name appear. But sometimes, truth finds its way through another path. One afternoon, my father happened to take her wallet to pay for medicine. In the stack of papers, he saw a pile of hospital invoices, and on them, my name stood clear. Elise Navarro. No one else. Helena later told me he stood there for a long time, hands trembling as he held the paper, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. My father had always been a man of few words, and even less likely to interfere in matters my mother managed. But this time, the truth lay bare and undeniable. The one who had paid the costs, the one who had quietly carried this family for years, was the daughter considered the least worthy of pride. That evening, I received a call. On the other end, only breathing, I whispered, "Dad?" No answer, only a faint sob. Then his voice, broken. I'm sorry." The tears came before I noticed. For the first time in all these years, I heard him say those words. An apology not tied to one specific thing, but carrying all the silence he had held. I never blamed him. He wasn't the one who built the invisible walls in our home. He had only lived within them so long that he forgot he could step out. But his tears that night meant more to me than any defense. Because at least one person in this family had truly seen me. And I realized, sometimes, truth doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be laid bare, clear enough that no one can pretend it isn't there. After my father's call, I sat for a long time in my apartment, the phone still warm in my hand. His choked sobs replayed in my head like a reminder that it was time to face things instead of hiding. The truth was already out, and more silence would only make the distance between my mother and me meaningless. So I decided to go to the hospital. I brought a bouquet of lavender, the flower my mother once loved, though no one had mentioned it in years. The hospital room was stark white, fluorescent lights washing her pale face. She lay on her side, eyes half closed, the familiar sternness still etched into her features even in weakness. I set the flowers on the table, pulled up a chair. She opened her eyes, startled at the sight of me. Her lips moved, but no words came. I didn't wait for her to speak first. I said softly, calmly, but firmly, "I don't expect you to change. I just want you to know, from now on, I won't live as a shadow anymore." I didn't say it to defy her, but to release us both. For years, my unconditional kindness had become obligation. As long as I kept giving, it was taken for granted. And the moment I stopped, resentment appeared. I would no longer allow my love to be twisted this way. She stayed silent a long while. Her fingers fidgeted with the blanket, her eyes fixed on the air. Perhaps she wasn't used to me drawing boundaries, but what mattered more was that I had dared to speak. I stood, straightened the bouquet. Before leaving, I added, "I still love you, but love doesn't mean I'll keep carrying everything." Walking out of that room, I felt lighter. Not because I'd received an answer, but because I had chosen to love with boundaries, no longer letting kindness become chains. Leaving my mother's room, I knew I couldn't stop there. For years, I had let silence fill the spaces, but now, silence was no longer a solution. I needed to speak to each of them, not to accuse, but to draw the boundaries that had never been there. The first was Lucas. We met at a cafe near the hospital. He arrived late, looking exhausted. I met his eyes and said slowly, "You're smart. You're capable of handling things yourself. I can't keep patching the holes you need to learn to fill." He stayed silent, his face caught between pride and shame, but finally he nodded. And in that nod, I saw acknowledgement, his first step into a life without the familiar lifeline. Next was Helena. We walked through the park, she pushing a stroller, trying to act casual. I said quietly, "You need to learn to say thank you, not just to me, but to anyone who helps you, because only with gratitude can we truly value what we've been given." She froze, lips trembling, then changed the subject. But I knew my words had planted something. Finally, Violet. She avoided my eyes, forcing a smile. I told her gently, "You have potential, but if you keep exploiting others' kindness, you'll never know how to stand on your own." Violet fell silent, her fingers twisting together like a child confronted with her first real consequence. I didn't walk away from those meetings feeling victorious. I only felt lighter, because finally, I had said what should have been spoken long ago. And I hoped this time, my love wouldn't become a burden, but an invitation for them to grow. After those conversations, I didn't expect instant change. But a few weeks later, Helena told me about an evening when the family gathered without me. This time, no one asked what I could do. No one said the familiar lines, "Maybe Elise can handle it," or "She'll know what to do." They just sat together, talking about ordinary things. Lucas shared about a surgery he'd finished, Helena about a parent meeting, Violet about a new discounted dress she bought. My mother stayed quiet, listening, occasionally smiling. My father sat in the corner, watching, nodding gently. Helena said that in that moment, she realized something strange. My absence made the room quieter, not because one person was missing to carry the weight, but because no one needed to strain to cover the gap anymore. For the first time, they had to face their own lives, without an invisible anchor to lean on. Hearing her recount this, my throat tightened. For years, my kindness had been given so easily that they forgot its value. Only when I pulled back did they start seeing each other, instead of always looking toward me. And I understood. Sometimes the truest love isn't to be there every time, but to let the emptiness teach them to appreciate. I don't know how much they'll change, but at least that moment proved one thing. When kindness is put in its rightful place, it no longer breeds dependence, it opens the door to growth. After that, I knew I had to learn how to give differently. No more urgent transfers in the middle of the night. No more frantic calls that I immediately rushed to fix. Kindness had once turned into obligation, but now I wanted it to become an opportunity for them to walk on their own feet. A few weeks later, Lucas called me, his tone as familiar as ever. "I've got a new loan I need to negotiate. Can you help?" In the past, I would have wired the money instantly, but this time I sent him a PDF, contacts for financial lawyers, along with some notes on negotiating interest rates. I texted, "You can do this. I believe in you." The line went quiet for a long time before Lucas finally replied, "Yeah, I'll try." With Helena, instead of paying for a babysitter like always, I drafted her a detailed schedule. School runs, time for herself, even mandatory rest hours. I included a few time management apps, adding a note. You don't have to be a superhero. Just know what to prioritize. For the first time in years, Helena replied with 2 words I hadn't heard from her in so long. Thank you. As for Violet, she messaged me about writing a CV for a new job. I didn't draft it for her this time. I sent her a link to a free online course with a few tips on weaving personal stories into resumes. I said, you have the ability, let others see you, not someone else's shadow. She only replied with a nodding emoji, but I knew a seed had been planted. I no longer showed up as the rescuer every time they called. I only left behind maps, letting them find their way. And I realized giving in this way made me feel lighter. For the first time, my kindness wasn't chains, but stepping stones for them to grow. Even as I changed how I gave, guilt sometimes lingered. I worried my withdrawal would make them think I was cold. But I came to see the importance of distinguishing between burden and affection. I couldn't keep carrying everything, but I still wanted to be present when family moments truly called for togetherness. I began returning home for the essentials. My father's birthday, a niece's graduation, the dinners my mother wanted the whole family to attend. I sat there, listening, sharing, smiling, but no longer letting anyone slip bills or subtle cries for help into my hands. At first, I caught their waiting glances, the old habit hard to break. But when I didn't respond, they gradually stopped asking. Instead, we actually talked. Lucas about the pressure of leading his medical team, Helena venting about parenthood but laughing at herself, Violet, finally, asking me about a book, not money or jobs. I realized it was my refusal of the burden that let our bonds grow closer again. When the shadow of responsibility no longer loomed over me, gatherings became real moments of sharing joy and sorrow, not checklists of what I had to fix. I still loved my family, but now, that love was no longer measured in transfers. It was measured in presence, in a hug, in the fact that I still came home, but with a free heart, not with shoulders weighed down. When I stopped tying love to burdens, my heart finally widened. And just then, a new door opened. Thomas was invited to Austin to open a branch for his company, and Mindy's had just received a partnership proposal there as well. We decided to move together, turning Austin into the beginning of a new chapter. The city was warmer than Seattle, sunlight spilling across oak-lined streets, making me feel like I was stepping out of heavy clouds into a real sky. We rented a small office in a co-working space, simple, but alive. It became more than just a workplace. It was where I started something I'd always dreamed of, teaching children how to code for free. The curious faces, the bright eyes when they wrote their first lines of code, reminded me of my 17-year-old self, hunched over in the library, unseen by anyone. The difference was that now, I wasn't silent. I gave knowledge not to prove my worth, not to carry anyone's weight, but because I wanted to. Because I felt joy watching a child discover opportunity. I finally understood. When kindness is freed from the role of bearing others' loads, it returns to being a true gift. And only then does it have the power to plant seeds, to help others rise on their own feet. When Austin became my second home, I discovered something simple. Life can be this light, once freed from invisible musts and shoulds. I began to laugh more, not the strained smiles at family dinners, but the sudden laughter when a child in class finished their first line of code, when Thomas handed me a clumsy but warm cup of coffee, or when I sat by the window reading a book without glancing at my phone to see who needed me. Once, I lived as though the phone could ring at any moment and I had to be ready like a firefighter. Not anymore. I set the phone aside, knowing that if someone called, they'd figure things out before turning to me. I was no longer the default lifeline. I was myself, a woman with limits, dreams, and joys of her own. I also stopped thinking of filial duty the old way. I still loved my parents, but no longer carried everything just to prove that love. I understood now. When kindness turns into obligation, it only breeds ingratitude. Only when given freely does it keep its meaning. And in that freedom, I found happiness. Not the kind that comes from praise or applause, but the quiet joy of finally living for myself. I thought I had lost my mother forever after her stroke. But to my surprise, that fall opened another path for her. As her health gradually recovered, the doctor recommended she attend therapy to ease her stress. At first, I didn't believe she would agree, yet somehow, she nodded. Helena later told me that each week, Mother sat quietly in the counseling room talking about her childhood, about the expectations she placed on her children, about her fear of being abandoned when she grew old. Hearing this, my heart sank. For all those years, I had only seen a controlling, critical, rigid mother. I had never considered the fears hidden beneath that hardened shell. One afternoon, Helena called, chuckling softly. "Mom's been telling her friends about you. She said, 'My daughter made an app that helps people sleep better.'" I froze, not because I needed her recognition, but because I knew for her to say those words, she had to loosen part of the pride she had clung to for so long. I had no illusions that my mother had completely changed, but I could see clearly that the distance between us was shifting, and I understood. If I hadn't drawn boundaries, if I had kept carrying the weight, she might never have had the chance to face herself. Sometimes love requires a break before it can rebuild. And for the first time, I believed my mother was learning to love me, not as a shadow, but as a real person. After my mother began to change, I noticed my father quietly did too. He had always been the quiet one, content to stay in the background, but this time, he was the one who surprised me most. One day, when I returned to the old house, I walked into the living room and saw a new frame on the wall. Not a family photo, not one of the portraits my mother adored, but the very first design of Mind Ease, a poster I had printed back when the company was still in its infancy. I had forgotten it in an old box, never imagining it would end up on that wall. My father said little. When I looked at him, all I saw was his gentle eyes and a slow nod. No explanation, no boasting. But I knew that act carried more weight than any words. In a house long filled with stories about Lucas's achievements, Helena's sacrifices, and Violet's pampered charm, for the first time, there was something of mine. Open, undeniable, hanging in the center of our home. I stood before that poster for a long while. Inside me, there was no trace of the old ache for recognition, only a quiet warmth. My father had seen me in his own way, and he had chosen to make sure everyone else did too. I realized then, sometimes love doesn't need grand declarations. Just a gesture, simple, yet undeniable. And that poster was proof that at last, I was no longer invisible in this family. After my father's gesture, I began to believe that small changes could find their way into every corner of the family. And the next surprise came from Violet. One evening, I received a message from her. Not a complaint about work, not a list of requests like before, just a single line. I just learned how to write a CV. Attached was a simple file, a clumsy self-introduction, but clearly written by her own hand. I read every word slowly, then smiled. I replied, "Good, be confident." Just 2 short sentences, but I knew they meant more than any resume I had ever drafted for her. In the past, Violet relied on my shelter. She believed as long as she asked, I would fix it. But now, she had started learning, trying, standing on her own feet. The CV wasn't perfect, but it was proof she was taking her first steps into adulthood. I felt a lightness in my chest. For years, I thought love meant doing things for others, carrying, shielding. But the truth was, only when I stopped did she finally find her own strength. And I realized, sometimes the greatest gift we can give isn't the finished result, but the space for someone else to figure it out. That dinner, the whole family gathered again after so many upheavals. No arguments, no boasting. Just a simple meal, with a few dishes my mother cooked, steam rising warmly from the broth. I sat down at the table, looking around. Lucas was talking about work, but with less tension in his voice. Helena still looked tired, but there was a gentler light in her eyes. Violet smiled shyly, sharing that she had just submitted her CV to a new company. Everything no longer revolved around what I could do for them. As I reached for the food, I instinctively placed a piece of chicken in my mother's bowl. An old habit, but this time, not out of duty, simply because I wanted to. She looked at me, hesitated, then gently picked up a piece and placed it in mine. No words, but in her eyes, I saw the recognition I had waited 30 years for. I smiled, my heart at ease. Perhaps we were never a perfect family, but after everything, we were learning again how to love, through small gestures, free of burden, free of chains. I understood then, sometimes things must break before they can be rebuilt. That kindness given too easily only breeds dependence, but kindness with boundaries opens the way for growth. That love is not carrying everything, but daring to give each other the space to grow together. And in that moment, when my mother placed food in my bowl, I knew I was no longer invisible in this home.